Maths professor tries to humiliate black student. Has no idea he's a math genius. She set him up to fail, right in front of the entire class. But when he solved a problem that even graduate students couldn't crack, the room's perception of her changed forever. The large lecture hall at the University of Michigan buzzed with the hum of low conversation. Students shuffled into their seats, flipping through battered notebooks and tapping the screens of their laptops. It was just another grueling Tuesday morning in Professor Anya Sharma's infamous advanced calculus class, a battleground where only the sharpest minds survived. Professor Sharma commanded the room like a storm rolling in. Her sharp features were framed by silver-rimmed glasses, a posture that brooked no defiance, and a piercing gaze that could turn a confident student's blood to ice. She was a legend, and a nightmare rolled into one. With her, there were no free passes, no leniency. If you wanted to pass, you earned it with sweat and brilliance. This morning, she was not in the mood for mercy. Her entrance was as precise as her reputation, heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor as she strode to the front. Without missing a beat, she grabbed a stick of chalk and snapped it in half with a decisive crack. The noise echoed, silencing the murmurs in the room. "Good," she said, brushing a stray strand of blonde hair from her face as she surveyed the now attentive audience. "In the last lecture, we tackled multivariable limits. Today, we move forward, Laplace transforms." Without hesitation, she turned to the chalkboard, her hand flying across the surface with practiced ease. Complex equations materialized in her flawless, razor-sharp handwriting, sprawling across the board in a dizzying maze of symbols. Pens scratched furiously as students struggled to keep up, their faces already etched with a mix of determination and quiet despair. Professor Sharma thrived in this charged atmosphere. She fed on the challenge, the tension, the silent competition. In her mind, this was where the true mathematicians rose to the surface, where the weak were separated from the extraordinary. She liked it that way. Chaos in the ranks only validated her belief that brilliance was rare, and that she alone could uncover it. But today, the storm she unleashed wouldn't go as planned. Somewhere near the middle of the hall, one student sat quietly, tapping his pen against his notebook. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't panicking. If anything, he looked bored. His name was Elias Thorne, tall, lean, and always dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Elias wasn't the type to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class and never made a spectacle of himself. But beneath that quiet demeanor, his mind worked faster than most. Numbers, patterns, equations, they made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. He glanced at the board, eyes scanning the equation. Something was off. A small mistake, just a minor one, but a mistake nonetheless. Elias hesitated. He could let it go, no one else seemed to notice. But then again, if she caught the mistake later, she might double back and waste time correcting it. Before he could decide, another student raised a hand hesitantly, a girl in the front row. Professor Sharma?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "I think there's an error in the second line." The professor turned slowly, arching a brow. "An error?" she repeated as if the very idea was offensive. She scanned the board, then smirked. "There is no error," she said flatly. The girl's face turned red, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed. Elias exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He hated this, the way some professors dismissed students, the way they acted as if they were beyond making mistakes. And before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Sharma's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, just for a second, of irritation in her eyes. "Oh?" she said, arms crossing. "Enlighten me." Elias stood up. Not out of arrogance, not to make a show of it, he just didn't like speaking from a seated position. "It's in the second step. You applied the transformation to the wrong term," he explained, pointing at the board. "The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer doesn't match the expected result." Silence. Sharma's jaw tensed. She turned back to the board, scanning her work. And then, there it was, the mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, Elias thought she might just admit it and move on. But then, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Thorne," she said, turning to face him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Elias could hear the unspoken message behind her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him hesitate, make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Elias set down his notebook, walked calmly to the front of the room, and took the chalk from her hand. He wasn't going to hesitate. But Professor Sharma had no idea what she had just set in motion. Elias stepped up to the board, chalk in hand. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in, the silent expectations, the professor's gaze drilling into his back, and the murmurs from students wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself. But he wasn't nervous. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Sharma's, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the numbers, and they lined up perfectly. He spoke as he worked, his voice even casual. The mistake was in how the transform was applied. You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. He finished the equation, set the chalk down, and stepped back. Then he turned. Professor Sharma stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed together. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a lecture hall full of students. Elias could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, brush it off, maybe even find a way to twist the situation so that she still looked right. Instead, she took a slow breath, nodding curtly. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations." Some students exchanged glances. That was it? No acknowledgement? No actual praise? Elias didn't need it. He just returned to his seat, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were impressed, a few seemed irritated, probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Professor Sharma turned back to the board, wiping away his work. "Let's move on," she said briskly. "Since Mr. Thorne is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Elias blinked. "Excuse me?" Sharma was already writing again, this time a much longer equation. It sprawled across half the board, filled with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. She finished the last symbol with a flourish and turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, "solve this." A few students shifted in their seats. Elias stared at the equation. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to make an example out of him. This wasn't a normal question, not for this level. The complexity alone made it clear she didn't expect him to get it right. She expected him to hesitate, stumble over the steps, maybe get part way through before realizing he was in over his head. She wanted to prove that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Elias exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He stood again, walking back up to the board. A few students chuckled under their breath, clearly expecting him to struggle. Sharma smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time," she said. Elias didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just solving. Every symbol, every number flowed from his mind to his hand effortlessly. He didn't even pause to think. His brain was already 5 steps ahead, visualizing the solution before his fingers had finished the previous line. The room grew quieter. The murmurs stopped. Professor Sharma's smirk faded. Halfway through the equation, Elias glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions?" She didn't answer. He kept going. A few more steps, a few simplifications, and then done. He underlined the final answer and turned around casually, setting the chalk back on the tray. Silence. A deep, consuming silence. Then, somewhere in the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Sharma's expression was unreadable. She scanned his work, line by line, searching for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. He had solved it. Not just correctly, but elegantly. The solution was clean and efficient. A few students started whispering, a few others leaning forward, clearly realizing what had just happened. Elias crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. Professor Sharma finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. "Lucky guess." A few students laughed under their breath, though not at Elias. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess." Sharma exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," she muttered. Elias turned and walked back to his seat. He could feel the shift in the room, the way people were looking at him now. Some with admiration, some with resentment, and one person, Professor Sharma, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had shifted. Elias could feel it. No one was looking at Professor Sharma the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her, that wasn't his goal. But he also wasn't about to shrink just to make her comfortable. Sharma turned back to the board, but she was gripping the chalk tighter now. She continued with the lecture, but her words lacked the same edge of authority they usually carried. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned back to the class, scanning the rows of students, and then her gaze landed back on him. "If you're so confident, Mr. Thorne," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled, others leaned forward, sensing something was about to go down. Elias didn't react. "What do you mean?" Sharma walked over to her desk, pulling out a thick textbook. She flipped through the pages before stopping on a section deep into the book, far beyond what they had covered in class. She turned the book around so the class could see the dense equations on the page. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem, "is from an advanced graduate level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. "But since you seem to have a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Elias exhaled slowly. He could see what she was doing. This wasn't about math anymore. She wanted to break him. This wasn't a test of skill, it was a power move. She wanted to push him past his limit and make him struggle in front of everyone. Maybe he'd get part of the way through, hesitate, and then she'd step in and remind the class why she was the authority in the room. He could refuse. He didn't owe her this. But the way the students were watching him, the way some were waiting for him to back down, made his decision for him. He stood up. Sharma's smirk wavered for just a second. Elias walked to the front of the room. She handed him the textbook, but he didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew the strategy. She had pulled this trick before, picking something just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But she had miscalculated. Elias lived for problems like this. He started writing. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The problem was tough, no question about it. But tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the chalk against the board. He didn't rush. He let each step unfold naturally, flowing from one equation to the next. Every simplification, every transformation, it was all leading to the inevitable answer. And then, finally, he boxed the final result. He turned back to the class. Silence. Sharma's face was unreadable, but her clenched jaw, the stiff way she held herself, he knew she had thought this would put him in his place. Instead, he had just made her look like a fool. A student in the back let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Yo, what even?" The students who had been skeptical were now staring at Elias differently. Sharma's hand twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something. She had to take back control of the room. "You've skipped a step," she said, her voice clipped. Elias raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't." Her fingers curled slightly. "Yes, you did." Elias turned back to the board, scanning the work. Then, without missing a beat, he pointed to a section near the middle. "This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, that's what you're talking about." Sharma didn't answer. He nodded. "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward." The class was dead silent. Sharma's face was tightening by the second. Elias turned back to her. "But if you'd like, I can write it out." The way he said it, it wasn't cocky. It wasn't even challenging. It was just matter of fact. And that made it worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Sharma inhaled sharply. "No, that won't be necessary." She turned back to her desk, setting the textbook down a little harder than she needed to. Elias could feel the shift in the air. He had just turned the class against her. But Sharma wasn't going to let this end here. Professor Sharma turned back to the class, her face composed, but her grip on the desk betraying her frustration. Elias sat down, but he knew this wasn't over. The way she stood there, her posture too stiff, her jaw too tight, she was trying to figure out her next move. The students, meanwhile, were still digesting what had just happened. Some were exchanging glances, others whispering in low voices. Then, a hand shot up from the second row. Professor? A student, Finnegan, one of Sharma's favorites, leaned forward. If he got it right, doesn't that mean Elias just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something? Sharma's lips pressed into a thin line. Finnegan wasn't wrong, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that she had underestimated Elias. I never said it was impossible, she responded smoothly. Only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate. There was something slippery about the way she said it, like she was already trying to rewrite what had happened. Elias let out a slow breath, staring at the desk in front of him. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class did. They needed to see what was happening here. Another student raised their hand. So, if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class? Sharma didn't answer right away. She glanced at Elias for a moment. There was something else in her eyes now, a calculation. Then, finally, she smiled. I think, she said, her voice softer now, Mr. Thorne would benefit from an academic challenge. A few students perked up. Was she actually recognizing his talent? Was she about to suggest a higher-level placement? Elias wasn't convinced. Which is why, Sharma continued, I'd like to invite him to a little competition. The murmurs started again. Elias frowned. What kind of competition? Sharma walked to her desk, pulling out a folder. She flipped it open, scanning the papers inside. There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month. Some of the best students from different schools in the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment, not just about solving problems, but about doing it under time constraints, with an audience. She looked up, eyes locking onto his. I assume you'd be up for it? Elias immediately understood what she was doing. This wasn't an opportunity, it was a setup. She wasn't just testing his math skills anymore. She was testing his ability to handle pressure, to see if he could perform outside the safety of a classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates, it would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best minds in the field. He could feel the weight of the room. People were waiting for his answer. If he backed down now, it would look like he had gotten lucky today, that he wasn't actually as capable as he seemed. And if he accepted, he'd have to win. Elias exhaled, then nodded once. I'm in. Sharma's smile didn't reach her eyes. Excellent. But she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Elias stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. A few nodded at him with newfound respect, others looked at him the way people look at an athlete about to enter a championship game, curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. Elias barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that people spent months, sometimes years, training for. That night, he sat in the campus library surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. Burning the midnight oil already, Elias looked up to see Finnegan standing by his table, hands in his pockets. He shrugged. Gotta be ready. Finnegan smirked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. Sharma's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Elias leaned back in his chair. I know. Finnegan studied him for a second. So why do it? Elias thought about that for a moment. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. But he also knew how people like Sharma operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation. She'd find a way to frame it, say that he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Elias wasn't going to let that happen. Because she expects me to lose, he finally said. And I want her to be wrong. Finnegan grinned. Now that I can respect. 4 weeks later, Elias stood in a large, auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania, staring at the panel of judges and the long digital timer displayed above the stage. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratched paper, pens, and one simple directive: solved the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Professor Sharma was in the audience. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement, no advice, just a polite nod when they arrived, as if she were a mere observer instead of the person who had thrown him into this. Elias knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack. The timer started. He didn't. The first round was mental math, solving problems without writing anything down. While some competitors hesitated, Elias's hands moved without pause, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. The second round was theoretical application, breaking down concepts into proofs. Here, his natural intuition took over. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns, rhythms, structures that built upon one another. The third round was speed solving. This was where most people tripped up. Pressure could make even the best students second-guess themselves. But Elias thrived under pressure. He kept going, ignoring the murmurs as his name crept higher and higher on the leaderboard. By the final round, there were only two competitors left in serious contention, Elias and a PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the screen. It was brutal, layers of integrals nested within summations, a problem designed to test not just knowledge but endurance. Elias's pulse steadied. He exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. But what happened next, no one saw coming. 1. The clock ticked down, the final seconds stretching like an eternity. Elias's fingers gripped the pen, his mind running through the layers of the problem faster than he could write. Every part of the equation had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no miscalculations. He could hear the faint scribbling of his competitor next to him, the MIT PhD candidate who was just as determined. They were neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Elias's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. He saw the pattern, the shortcut no one else would see. And that was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He knew. Final answer. He boxed it and set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Elias looked up, his breathing steady. His competitor was still writing. The room was dead silent. Then, one of the judges stood up, walking over to examine both answers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. After a long pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Elias Thorne. The room erupted. Some students clapped, some let out audible gasps. But Elias didn't react right away. He just exhaled, letting the reality of it sink in. He had won. Not just against the other students, but against the expectations placed on him, against the professor who had doubted him, against the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him before he had the chance to define himself. Professor Sharma was motionless in the crowd. Elias met her gaze for the first time. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Elias didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, Elias walked into class, taking his usual seat. Sharma entered a few minutes later, just as composed as always. But this time, when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on him with something different: respect. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium. Elias Thorne took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country." She continued, her voice even. "That is no small achievement." A few students clapped. Finnegan shot Elias a knowing grin. Sharma turned back to the board. "And with that said, let's begin." That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long speech, just an acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. Because Elias hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something to himself. And he had. Because sometimes, the best way to change people's minds isn't through words, it's through undeniable truth.